Let's get all your business news. Rupio Madzena joining me in studio. And you've got some good news. Of course, inflation is down in that important band. Do you think that the Reserve Bank is going to cut us some slack tomorrow and hold back on hiking interest rates?
That is the big question, and we're all very hopeful, but they might hit us with one more. We actually do have Dr. Azar Jammine standing by to answer that question, but for a bit of context, it was better than expected inflation figures that came through, and that may see the Reserve Bank put a pause on hiking interest rates tomorrow. So consumer inflation drastically eased to 5.4% in June from 6.3% in the month before. Now, the inflation rate is below the central bank's target ceiling of 6% for the first time in 14 months. The central bank has been relentless in hiking interest rates since November 2021 to contain price rises. The latest inflation figure was driven largely by lower food costs. Food inflation eased to about an 11-month low of 11%. So we've been speaking to economists about that, and that's actually bringing Dr. Azar Jammine to the conversation. He's the chief economist at Econometrix. Thank you very much for your time this evening, Doc. And let's speak about that. The inflation data that came through came in better than expected. There were fears around electricity inflation contributing to higher inflation and many other pressures. What did you make of the print that was released by Stats SA?
Well, isn't it wonderful to get some good news about the economy for a change? No, the figure was, we were expecting a big drop in inflation, mainly because fuel prices have fallen in the last couple of months, whereas a year ago they had screamed up by, in fact, between May and July last year by R5 a litre. So on a year-on-year basis, you know, one is now looking at petrol prices that are below where they were a year ago. And that was the main reason why we expected a decline. But the decline was even greater than most people had anticipated. And there's one thing that has emerged that the Reserve Bank's own research showed, and that is that what happens to fuel doesn't stay at fuel. It actually gets transmitted further into the food price chain. When fuel prices rise sharply, your food producers see this as a huge increase in their cost and just pass that on to consumers in the form of higher food prices. It appears as if the opposite is now occurring, and lower fuel prices are contributing to lower than expected food inflation. The other factor that obviously helped keep food inflation low was less intense load shedding than previously anticipated. Economists were spectacularly amiss in not forecasting that load shedding would bring about an increase in food inflation over the past year due to disruptions to broiler production, to irrigation, and due to refrigeration not being available a lot of the time in the food industry due to lack of electricity. So all these are now falling into place. And the final factor that has fallen into place positively is that the rand has bounced back almost 10% against the dollar and by 5-6% against other currencies in the past month, and that reduces inflationary pressures further. The fuel price effect hasn't ended. Next month, we're looking for yet another very good inflation number.
Yeah, very exciting times indeed, especially when it comes to the pressures that consumers have been facing. So the big question then is, Doc, before we speak about other components of this economic data, is will we see the Reserve Bank potentially then hold interest rates tomorrow, or might it be the last 25 basis points increase that we'll be seeing for a while?
No, I think that in the face of this good news, there's now very high likelihood that we're going to see a pause in interest rates, and that, in fact, interest rates may not rise any further over the coming year.
And then what does
I'm not suggesting that they're going to come down quickly.
You wipe the smiles right off our face with that last statement there, Doc. But then with the medium-term outlook, do we foresee some kind of a decrease in interest rates within the next year in 2024, where the Reserve Bank perhaps tries to get back to levels that we were at before the COVID-19 pandemic?
There will be opportunity for the Reserve Bank to decrease interest rates next year, but they're not going to be in a rush to do so, partly because they are really focusing on 4.5% as being the inflation target. And so long as inflation remains above that level, they're going to be reluctant to want to cut interest rates. And we don't see inflation falling below 4.5% until the end of next year, possibly into 2025.
And that's interesting, Doc, because I was wondering, did the level of aggressiveness that the SARB and other interest banks around the world, central banks rather, because the UK also reported inflation coming down below 8% for the first time in a while, the same happening in the US last week at 3%, closer to their target of 2%. That aggressive stance that was taken by central banks, would it not warrant the seeing of, the inflation number being within the target range, the center of the target range rather, sooner rather than the end of next year, because of that aggressiveness starting to seep through the economy? And we're seeing that with the last inflation print that we had and this latest data that came through today.
You may be correct, and I don't want to be dogmatic about that not being a possibility. But, you've got to watch the rand. It's doing well right now. And with the news about Putin not coming into the country, that will help it again even further in the next month or so in the run-up to the BRICS summit. But on the other side, there are a couple of dangers. You mentioned electricity. Well, at the municipal level, electricity tariff increases only came into effect at the beginning of July. So we haven't yet seen the full effect thereof. And then the fact that Russia has now terminated the Black Sea grain agreement to allow Ukraine to export food freely through the Black Sea is a potential renewed inflationary pressure. And finally, we've seen a diminution in the intensity of load shedding, but we're not out of the woods yet. And, you could see an increase in the intensity of load shedding anew that could upset the apple cart. And then on top of that, you've got all these municipalities who are raising rates of taxes willy-nilly at levels way above inflation. So, we're not totally out of the woods yet for me to be too confident in saying that we're going to be back at 4.5% already within a year.
No, thank you very much for that update, Dr. Azar, Jammine, just breaking down the reasons that we saw the print that came out today and the short to the medium-term outlook. What will happen tomorrow, what's likely to happen tomorrow, is that we might get a hold from the South African Reserve Bank based on the data that came through today. But we'll have to see that announcement happening just after 3 p.m. tomorrow. And, of course, we'll be giving you all the analysis on eNCA from the morning before that announcement happens. On